unsullied by us humans, sex is a very good part of human life.
We live our lives in a great deal of hypocrisy, telling our children to do one thing while we do something else.
The quest for control. We all would love it if our lives were a bit more controllable.
Discussions within the Christian community about these questions will be primary for the survival of the Christian community.
It's a delight to be here. I'm grateful to Chris, to John, to everybody who's put the conference together. It is a real treat for me not to be going to the Mayo Clinic in February and to be coming to Chicago instead. Although I'm not sure who was supposed to be in charge of weather, but at Georgetown we would never have subjected you to this type of humidity. So I have an hour with you to explore some of the ethical issues in long-term care. And you have a very detailed outline, which I don't begin to promise to cover, but it's offered in the hopes of taking materials home that might prove to be useful. And if any of it is, I'm delighted. The topic is near and dear to my heart because when I was a brand new nursing student, I was living in a long-term care community that was sponsored by my community, the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth. And we had a sister, one of our members of my own community, Julie, who had multiple sclerosis, who was in the long-term care facility. And every evening when I would visit her after supper, she would say and bemoan the fact that nobody would miss her when she was gone. And as a young person who had no dealing with serious chronic or acute illness at that point in my life, certainly not in a family member or in a friend, I was absolutely clueless of what it meant to be present to Julie. And she became the tip of the iceberg for many individuals and families that I have continued to meet in my personal ministry. And it makes this subject, I said, very close to the heart to say, what do we owe our most vulnerable members of society? In particular, people who are separated sometimes from families and from supportive communities. So my goals would be to look quickly at the difference between healing and curing and to say, what does a healing environment in long-term care look like? To help us to revalue the type of healing relationships that make a difference. Recently, I was asked to review a chapter on spirituality, and the author made the claim, and it's so true, when you look at the theory-practice gap, that while we teach healthcare practitioners when they're students, that spiritual health and emotional, psychological health are essential components of health, and that there's an interplay between physical, psychological, and spiritual. Once most people start practicing, the practice setting does not demand that they be competent in addressing psychological and spiritual needs. And so there's lovely theory in the text, and I say that as somebody who's written a chapter on spiritual care in a fundamentals nursing book. But once people get out into practice, do we demand that? And do we enhance those competencies? What does it mean to be engaged in a healing relationship? Do we view our first responsibility to be a healing presence, and then our technological competence comes in behind that? Then to look at some of the ethical challenges in long-term care, and lastly, and perhaps most importantly, to look at some of the fears that people bring to that experience and to ask ourselves what it means to be present in a helpful way. I want to begin with a couple of reflection questions because I think as never before, it's important for us in this culture here in the United States, as well as members of faith communities, to prompt to find some way to initiate serious reflection and discussion on these questions. And the first simply asks, what does it mean to be finite? If you think about coming to a long-term care community, it signals that we're at a point in our lives where if we've been busy doing stuff, whether that's raising a family, having a career, earning money to support, when we reach that long-term care community, that stuff that has filled our productive, some would say years, comes to a crashing halt. And now we've got to make sense of the fact that our abilities aren't limitless, that in spite of what American culture says to us, we're not masters of the universe. One of the most thought-provoking experiences I had was at the Philadelphia Geriatric Center, where I used to take students for 4 years. And there were a lot of very depressed Jewish women. And as I struggled to make sense of that, many of them came from families where they did play a leading role, and they were in control of the dynamics in that family. And what happened, as because of changes related to aging, things happened in their bodies or in their social situation that they couldn't change. God forbid a son died. They lost their vision. They became too frail to get around the way they would like. There was no ability to cope and to adjust with those changes. And without a previous history of adapting positively, many of them became profoundly depressed. Now, I'm not suggesting certainly that this is a unique Jewish phenomenon, but in my experience, that was the first place that it hit me. And it said a lot to me about welcoming change and looking at how I adapt and welcome things in my life that take me out of a comfort zone. But it's a fundamental question, what does it mean to be finite? A lot of American healthcare is structured on the fact that we ought to be able to control everything that happens to us. And today, the debate is ongoing. We ought to be able to produce perfect children, and we ought to be able to control the time and manner of our dying. Everything about what it means to be creatures says that's a false hope. So how do we deal with that? The second question asks, what does good care at the end of life look like? It amazes me, as somebody who taught gerontological nursing for 4 years, how quick we are to identify developmental needs in infants, children, and adolescents, even young adults. That you press a practitioner to identify the developmental need of an older person, and they have no idea what to do. So they'll tape record parents' voices, and they'll play them in the NICU, and they'll define great developmentally challenging environments for kids. But we don't necessarily see older people as having developmental tasks to achieve. If you look at the needs of the dying, there has been a lot of inattention until most recently, I'd say within the last 5 years, to identify what the criteria of good end of life look like. At the end of this outline, there's a set of criteria from the American Geriatric Society. And a number of years ago, they said if we don't identify the criteria that will allow us to hold ourselves accountable, we will continue to let people not die well. Since the publication of that, there's been a lot more in the literature. But if we need to take time in our long-term care institutions to say, what is the standard that we're going to hold ourselves to? What are those things that are important to us? Participants in a recent study identified 6 major components of good dying. One was pain and symptom management, which because of JACO, if for no other reason, is now getting huge attention. The second is clear decision-making. Clear decision-making. What is the goal? What are we about here? How can we best achieve it? Preparation for death. Preparation for death. Completion. If you look at Erickson's developmental stages, the last stage is integrity versus despair. When you come to the end of life, that's the life review. Can you look back at your life and say, this is good? Think about the accounts in Genesis. God created and he said, this is good. We're invited to be co-creators. At the end of life, can we look back and say, this is good? If we can't, there's despair. And who is it who helps people at the end of life to walk that journey? And who of us are skilled in that? And if there are pieces of our life that we're not comfortable with, that we haven't made our peace with, how does that get addressed? The contribution to others. What am I contributing, especially if I'm separate from family and friends, as well as an affirmation of the whole person. So 6 suggestions for things that are important at the end of life, and a real critique about the communities in which people are aging to say, how well do we do that? Other questions for our culture, and I might say there, if you think about that, what does a good setting look like? To me, one of the most pressing ethical questions in long-term care is the commitment that we have in this culture to ensure that we have competent and compassionate healthcare professionals to be present to people. I'm just back from the California Association of Services and Homes for the Aging. Their top 3 problems, number 1, was an inadequate workforce. They couldn't find aides or nurses. I spent 4 years trying to develop a gerontological specialty in a baccalaureate nursing program in an attempt to attract some of the best and brightest to choose gerontological nursing as an area of specialty, to put it on par with maternity and peds, to say this is good work. Today in this culture, if somebody says, I want to be a nurse, or I want to be a teacher, or I want to be a social worker, many parents say, is that all? Can't you do better? Because it's hard work. And we think about who we entrust our most vulnerable to. And this is something that you can't mandate a staffing ratio to fix the problem, because if those people aren't there, in my institution, Georgetown, about 1/3 of our graduating nurses want nothing to do with bedside nursing. The nursing degree is a stepping stone to a master's in law, in health administration. They want pharmaceutical rep jobs. But there's a real, and that's a family matter. What do we teach our children about these service professions? Some of the other questions, do people have the right to choose the time and manner of their dying? I'm not going to talk about the assisted suicide debate. There's a piece at the end of this outline that really pulls out some of the ethical issues there. The 4th question for long-term care, and when you think about vulnerable persons, is a critical one, and it is that question that says, if we grant the right to die, is it reasonable to assume that for some that will be the duty to die? And I just give you here the example of my mother. She spent 15 years taking care of my grandmother, who had had a series of strokes. Now, my mother is a very Catholic, very pro-life woman. But she has said to each of her 4 daughters, I don't want any of you to ever have to do what I did. In other words, if I become frail and dependent, I don't want you to have to sacrifice your lives to take care of me. Now, I don't think any one of the 4 of us would ever not want to be there for my mother. But in a culture that says it's reasonable for parents not to make those demands on their children, wouldn't it be perhaps not so off-putting for me to suggest to my mother, if she becomes too inconvenient, that the noble thing for her to do would be to bow out? The generous thing for her to do would be not to inconvenience her family. And people can make those parallels. If it's okay for me legally to terminate an inconvenient pregnancy, why not terminate an inconvenient parent or an inconvenient aging aunt or an uncle? And that's part of the being 11 in society, is to look at some of these thoughts that, while initially they might seem reprehensible to some of us, can become pervasive. And then they go to the thinking that influences what we say yay or nay to, what people's expectations are, and then how society develops as the legal and other protections for that. And lastly, in what concrete ways do our faith commitments influence our response to the above questions? And that's the real challenge for many Americans who profess to have convictions, faith convictions, and yet don't often see those dictating the way they think about things. It was, she was actually a Catholic sister who had been a midwife, who for some reason was now doing gerontological nursing. And she said, the first time I sat with a dying resident, I was overcome by the parallels to her midwifery experience. And she said, if we're Christian and we believe that the full perfection of life isn't here and now, then shouldn't our dying rooms look more like our birthing rooms? And it was a profound challenge. Now, obviously, we can grieve the death of somebody that we care about and emotionally be present to that person differently in their dying than we were at their birth. But if we believe that God is calling us home, and that's part of what makes end-of-life decision-making so difficult, because I think some people who are fighting the death-on-demand culture have retreated into a vitalism that says life at all costs. And that, to me, seems very strange that we would raise a fist to a loving God who calls us home at some point because we're creatures to say you can't have this life. And the challenge to wisdom is to know when that point is. When have we done everything that we possibly can to use, to affirm the gift of life that God has given us? When are we being called home? And then when is it time to let go? And how do we help people in all walks of life who are struggling with these decisions? But the challenge is, what does our faith entail? I was on a panel with an oncologist from Yale a couple years ago, and he talked about having had in his practice a woman who had died long and horribly from a cancer. I don't know if it was a breast cancer or what. And he said the last year of her life was just utterly painful to her and to him, who cared about her. And he said, when she died, I felt whipped, beaten, destroyed. And the chaplain who had walked that last year with her wrote an essay and shared it with the oncologist. And he said the chaplain described this as this transformative experience for her. And he couldn't make sense of the fact that for him this was such a negative and overwhelming, whereas for the chaplain it was such a positive experience. And I said, Tom, like, no joke here, you don't see good dying as a legitimate aim of medicine. So when she dies, it's a failure to you. Whereas for the chaplain, who saw moving on to the next stage as a goal, this was a good dying, because the woman was peaceful and ready to move on. Now that's what I mean when you say, where do our faith convictions take us? How do they affect the everyday experience of who we are and what we're about? So those are my set, and there may be others, but I think it's important for us to challenge society with these questions and to say, how does, what difference does it make how we answer them? Okay, the goal, aim, telos of elder care is health and human well-being then, and that encompasses good dying. What are we about in elder care? It's about not just bodily health, but about human well-being, and part of human well-being embraces a concept of good dying. Galen, I still think, has the best definition of health I've read. He said it's that state of integrity or wholeness in which people are unimpaired in doing what matters to them. And when I say, or doing what's important, that isn't simply I define the own goals. When you say what's important to somebody, there's also a normative element there. And so part of the role of the healthcare professional is to say, what are good things to value at the end of life? And then how can we develop an environment that helps people to accomplish that? It means so much more than looking at healthcare using the car mechanic or car repair shop model. That says the body is a machine. And if you look at what's happening in many of our long-term care institutions and systems, and I don't mean the expensive ones where people who can pay for designer care go. I'm talking about the ones that have a good mix of publicly financed folks. Oftentimes what they can do as resources become scarce is a high goal is to keep people clean, to keep people mobile. They're little more than bodies that need to be washed and kept fed. Now, if you use that car repair shop model and we reduce health care to that, then what do you do when a car no longer merits your putting money to fix it? We have scrap piles, we have junk yards for cars. And I would suggest that some of our long-term care institutions have become just that. They're places where we store machines that are no longer functioning. And other than meeting minimal standards of what doesn't count as an egregious violation of care, and many of us, and if you look at what we as American citizens have allowed, it is that. And we count on regulation to fix that problem. So we say, we'll regulate the nursing home industry. Well, regulation, it's the one of my biggest fears today is that ethics is going to be reduced to compliance. So we say, how do we get people to do the right thing? We can't appeal to their generosity, to their nobility, to their wisdom. We say, here's what you have to do to keep yourself out of trouble. If you don't want to jeopardize federal monies, if you don't want to lose your state license, if you don't want a low accreditation score, here's what you have to do. And we don't say, how do we form people with the right character and the right competencies and the interpersonal skills to create the right environments, to care for people who can't do that for themselves. Those of you that are working in long-term care or in any, you know, in an environment where somebody all of a sudden, an institution starts doing things differently because the accreditors are coming. That's what I'm talking about. And staff see the duplicity of that. We're not doing this because it's the right thing to do. We're doing it because we're being evaluated. So it's a very different model of ethics. So a significant question to everybody who's involved in long-term care, and most of what I want to be saying is certainly applicable to all types of health care, but you say, what does it mean for me to be a healing presence, and is that the culture that pervades this institution? There's a questionnaire at the end of that outline that raises those questions in the context of long-term care. But I would ask you to think about, if you're on the front lines of providing care, or if you're at an administrative level or leadership position, how does your personal life contribute to your being a healing presence? At the end of the day, are the people who work with you better for having been in your presence, or are they diminished? And that's a sobering reflection. I know people that when they walk into a room, I mean, you can say there's grace, but people are better for having been in their presence. And I know people who walk into a situation and everybody can be up and they leave it worse. What in our personal life? And that's part of the healing that we need to do if we're going to present ourselves as healers. And I'm just going to make a quick comment here, and then I'm going to conclude this section. But when you think about the healing as opposed to curing, goes to that whole process of becoming, that even when we're faced with negative experiences, and that might be a move to a long-term care. My mother just sold our family home. It was a tragic experience, one that I don't think I can still fully appreciate. But she said to me just last week, Carol, it was the worst thing, she's lived through some hard stuff. It was the worst thing I had to do. And she can't find the house to move into. She sold hers quickly. She's living with my sister now, which is a great arrangement. But the selling of the family home, where we had lots of family memories, she said it was the worst thing that I've had to do in my life. What healing is about is to say, even whether it's physical illness, it's an experience like that, there's a way to take that and to grow. And how do we be present to folks who are dealing with experiences like that in a way that can turn those experiences around? Quick quote from a friend of mine who's actually in her mid-50s, who's been dealing with horrible cancers, to talk about the type of healing and becoming that I'm speaking of here. She says, I want to tell you about one good trade. This was in an essay where she talked about how her 3 cancers had resulted in her losing a lot of the things that were important, and they were all negative experiences. Then she said, here's the good trade. It's been the hardest one by far, it's ongoing. I had to trade in my old definition of me. I thought I was my abilities, my job, the amount of money I made, the highest degree I earned, the way I looked, the way I cooked, the presents I gave. I had to figure out that those things aren't me. They're a part of me, and losing them counts, but they're not me. The girl God made is that stripped down substance soul underneath all those things. I had to figure out how to be brave enough to let that me be enough. Be me, ungift wrapped. That's a huge shift in thinking, a huge shift toward truth, naked living, vulnerable, scary, but real, really real. The first time I got so weak from chemo that I couldn't feed myself, I thought I would become completely undone. This is a proud woman. It was the fact of somebody having to feed her. My personal dignity was so tangled up in my ability to control my body and its functions, with my independence, my abilities. I cared so much about what the person holding the spoon thought of me. It's still hard for me to trade down, and I fight to keep as much control of my life as I can. But at least some of the time, I can remember what part is really me. I'm still me when my friend is feeding me, still me when I need help, maybe even more me. I'm glad I've had the time to learn the things that dying has taught me. I'm closer to being an authentic person than I would have been without this. Right now, I'm not so worried about taking my last breath. I'm more worried about having the emotional stamina to stay real all the way to the end. I pray for that. I want to die with my eyes wide open. Now that's the sort of challenge, perhaps not articulated as eloquently, but that's the challenge at the end of life. What does it mean to be that stripped down girl, boy God made? That's underneath all those externals, Aristotle's accidentals. And that's a lifelong journey to realize that. And how do we develop a healing environment that helps people to raise, to ask, and to answer those questions? There was a great New York Times piece that looked at despair at the end of life, that looked at the assisted suicide question in the context of aging and long-term care, and said what we need is a spirituality of aging that addresses that need for meaning and purpose, forgiveness, love, and belonging. If we don't have that, how do we expect people to wake up to another day? I was at a conference recently, and a psych mental health nurse in a Veterans Administration hospital said she's seeing a lot of the World War II vets now getting into her group sessions, some with serious and some less serious psychiatric mental health problems, because at this point in their life, a lot of the unresolved things from World War II are percolating up. And if you think about the way we deal with life experiences in this culture, most of us experience them and then move on. So you have a bad experience, but we're busy. So you think of somebody coming back from World War II, they had the GI Bill, they got educated, they were married, they had kids, they had jobs, and they didn't have to deal with it. Now they're sitting quietly, and there's no escape, so it's all here. And that's the challenge of being a healing presence. Say, how do we deal with it? And go back to those 3 spiritual needs. Meaning and purpose. What does this mean in my life? To be able to forgive. And then the experience of love and belonging. Okay, that by way of a long introduction. I'm not going to speak too much to the death and dying piece other than to accentuate the points that I raised earlier. There are 4 paradigms operative for thinking about death and dying. One is death as a natural part of life. In most parts of the country, we have lost that because we medicalize dying. Death as a natural part of life was where You know, you were born on the farm, you worked the farm, you got sick, you got your bed moved into the kitchen, you died on the farm. And as a kid, you saw people and animals being born, living, and dying. And it wasn't a reality that was uncomfortable. Today, if you think about long-term care and the way we've fragmented life, many people don't see people dying. One of our young sisters, who is now doing parish ministry, called me one night terrified. And she had just gotten a call from a husband whose young wife had just died of breast cancer at home. And there were 2 small children. And Michelle, he asked her to come over. And she certainly wanted to come over, but she said, "Carol, I'm terrified. I've never seen a dead person." This from a woman in her mid-30s. I've never seen. That's what I mean when we say death, not as a natural part of life, but the second paradigm, we've medicalized dying. If you think of aging, some of Dan Callahan's work, he challenged the notion that the last frontier was aging, as if it were somehow something we were going to solve. It goes back to that, what does it mean to be finite? If you medicalize dying, then it's a problem to be solved, not a mystery. And at the very least, we can make it good dying. And yet the fact of the matter is, this is part of the unfair natural lottery. Some of us are going to die peacefully in our sleep, and some of us are going to die long, hard deaths. And we don't know which of us it will be. Who of us will be gone tomorrow? Who of us will die sleeping in our beds at the ripe age of 98 or 104? And who of us will have a long, debilitating, painful illness that will result in great inconvenience to our families and those who love us? There's hospice, and I'm not going to speak more to that. And obviously, the 4th paradigm is the death on demand, that either we as individuals or societies ought to determine whose lives are not worth living. And I think it's not alarmist to suggest that we pay attention to that. And if you've read the pre-Nazi Germany literature, I was at the Holocaust Museum for a conference on the anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, and they called it Hippocrates Betrayed. But one of the speakers actually detailed one of the nicest slippery slope arguments that I've ever seen. And he talked about how after World War I and the Versailles Treaty, there was a real social Darwinism at play, where the idea was if you wanted to survive well as a country, as a nation, it wasn't in your best interest to allocate scarce financial and other resources to your weakest members. It was survival of the fittest. And the genocide didn't start in the concentration camps with the Jews. It started in the psychiatric mental health hospitals. It started in the homes for handicapped children. And judgments were made that these were useless eaters. And to show how rationality works, the government started by reducing the money, the public monies, that went to the support of those homes. And then somebody said, we don't have enough money on this budget to feed people. So wouldn't it be more compassionate to end their lives than to allow them to starve to death? The same debate that we've seen play out in other places here. But first the judgment was made that these were useless eaters. There's powerful posters from that period. There's one that shows the strapping Aryan worker yoked on both shoulders with 2 useless eaters. And the message of the poster was that every working German is supporting 2 of these folks. The other showed 4 bags of money. The smallest money was what it took to educate a healthy, a normal child. The largest bag was what it took to educate and care for a severely handicapped child, with a clear visual image that that was a waste of scarce resources. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're there, but look at the resources that we presently commit to some of our frailest members. If you haven't done a recent tour of public nursing homes, I would encourage you to do it. All right. So what I want to use the last of my time then is to look at some of the common fears. I think two of the central questions and fears circle around the control issues. If you talk to people like Derek Humphrey and other leading proponents of assisted suicide and death on demand, many of them have had family members who got into the system and lost control. When they were ready to die, they weren't allowed to die. And that was the old problem. The newer problem is that we will want to live, and we won't be allowed to live because somebody will decide that we're costing too much money. If you read the medical thrillers, with the advent of managed care, there was a whole genre of fiction that came up on health plans, finishing off patients who were costing the system too much money. There were deathbeds with, lethal organisms and all that sort of stuff. But if it's in fiction, people are thinking it. I actually facilitated a session of regulators, financial regulators for health plans at a Woodstock meeting, and I think it was the person from HCFA who said, I hope we won't move to a point in this country where we will see euthanasia as an answer to our problems. But the mere fact that it could be articulated should be setting off a lot of alarms. So those are two huge fears, and I don't have time to get into addressing them. Some of the fear that we won't be allowed to die has been adequately addressed legally. I mean, that's what the whole advance directive, finding out preferences, kind of the whole autonomy critique of paternalism was about. And I can respond to specific questions that you might have. The third fear is that fear that people will die in horrible, unrelenting, intractable pain. And that is currently a huge topic that is receiving a lot of attention. Again, even though we now have a new set of JCAHO-endorsed standards to deal with pain and symptom management, unless people want to do it, the hugest barrier has been that it hasn't been high profile for most practitioners. We're beginning to see physicians taken to court because they're not appropriately responding to pain and human suffering. The huge thing here, and this is a big education thing, especially in long-term care, there needs to be the same type of vigilance with the elderly who can't communicate their needs that you would have for a toddler. I've never had kids of my own, but I used to look at my sisters and say, how do you do it when a child can't speak what they need? And so, if somebody's tugging on an ear, you say, is that an earache? Is that a bellyache? And you've got to think, is the child dehydrated? Well, the same type of vigilance is ongoing with our demented elderly, with people who can't communicate their needs. And whereas we do it so naturally for a toddler, for an infant, it doesn't oftentimes naturally happen for an older person. And so where do we hone that heightened vigilance that we dedicate to our young, to our older members of society who can no longer communicate? And this is the difference. We haven't done a great job with addressing physical pain. If we haven't done a great job addressing physical pain, what about suffering? Pain is the body's response to a noxious stimuli. I get my fingers caught in the car door. I'm going to experience pain. Suffering, Eric Cassell says, is the human response to a threat to self. If I get home tomorrow and find out that my mammogram shows a suspicious lesion, I may have no pain in this breast, but you better believe I'm going to start suffering. Because breast cancer will pose a threat to myself. If my mother sells her house, the family home, there may be no physical pain with that, but there has been exquisite suffering because the self that she knew is being threatened. Now, maybe in positive ways, and that's the whole healing thing. That goes back to the quote, my friends, I made all these bad trades. I traded down, but there's a good trade. It makes us ask, what is life about? Who am I? But that doesn't happen automatically. And some people need a lot of help to make those connections. The fourth fear is the fear of becoming increasingly dependent. Now, some people do this very well. I've got young friends who have already honed dependence to a great art, and people are tired of meeting their needs. But there's also people, and I think I have enough of my German dad in me, who fear dependence like the plague. I can manage myself. Thank you. 4 suitcases, I can get them out to the car. Okay, I don't need you. Listen to that. I don't need you. I'm more comfortable meeting my own needs, taking care of myself, being independent. That's what our society says. That's who we ought to be. Society values independence. Developmental psychologists will tell us we start life dependent as infants. Those of you who have had teenagers, with great angst, we establish our independence. The third developmental challenge is interdependence. Okay, the fact of life is some of us operate at different times from a period of resourcefulness and strength, others from a period of neediness, and it's in the intermeshing of those two groups that we experience our humanity. It's not easy. If you have a parent with Alzheimer's, you have a handicapped child, mentally or physically, this is not an easy road. And yet there's something in our humanity that is forged when that interdependence gets played out. And I have great fears for us as a culture if we give the message to people that it's not okay to be needy. That has simply never been part of the human experience. So on the one hand, we want to use science to make progress. And there's a great quote at the beginning of this outline. It comes from the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic institutions. I think it applies to everybody, and it says, we've got to look at scientific advances to say, when is this true moral progress, and when is it a violation of our human dignity? Kind of the fact that we can do something doesn't mean that we ought to do it. That's the ethical question. So on the one hand, we're trying to alleviate suffering, prevent disability, cure illness, and that research and progress needs to go forward, but not at the expense of our humanity. And part of the challenge to faith-based communities is to prompt the wise reflection, to grow the wisdom that allows us to make those tough determinations. How often have you heard people say, I would rather die now than become a burden on my family? And yet if that's part of, how do we, and then part of the challenge for us is how do we support family caregivers who are in hard times? Do people have to walk that road alone? And a lot, sometimes it's simply acknowledging the burden of caregiving for that somebody, you know, in a nursing home, it's like you see the family member walking in and it's the demanding family and you want to run the other way. You know, how do we teach the ethical response of simply approaching that person and say, how's it going for you? Who asked that? And that's a trade. People have to be taught to pay attention to family caregivers. How is it going for you? That somebody knows, by golly, they see me as a person in my own right. Just a real quick story here. My mother, after caring for my grandmother for all those years, always worried that she wasn't doing enough. And my grandmother was the type person, she was pleasantly confused. But if my mother sat down at the end of the day to watch TV, my grandmother would want her to be doing something. And my mother, if she wasn't constantly being attentive to her, felt she was failing. And I spent years telling my mother what a marvelous job she was doing and trying to help out. It wasn't until we had my grandmother evaluated for home care, for an aide, and the nurse that came in to do the assessment said to my mother what a great job she was doing. My grandmother's skin was good, her nutrition was good, blah, 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 blah. My mother called me that night and she said, Carol, the nurse told me I'm doing a great job with Mom. I said, Mother, I've been telling you that for the last 5 years. She said, but she's the nurse, okay? You're my daughter. And I wanted to find that nurse because it was like this burden had been lifted from my mother, that she wasn't doing enough. And I will never forget that nurse because she made me realize I'm my mother's daughter, but for other families, I'm the nurse. Do I use the authority that I have? Because this individual made a huge difference in my mother's sense of peace, in my mother's well-being. And all it took was a few words. That's the type of thing that I'm talking about here. Now, I would have loved to have done this whole presentation on dignity and aging. But if you look at, in particular, the frail elderly, we've got to ask, how many people have you heard say, I'd rather die as I am. I want people to remember me this way than frail, incontinent, smelly, delirious, because I'll lose my dignity. Now that too flies in the face of what Christianity says is the source of our dignity. Our dignity isn't based. The Hobbesian notion is society sets up the criteria that says this is what makes somebody worthy of respect. So by golly, I'm a Georgetown professor, and I finally have a PhD in hand. So I hope you're going to be more respectful of me than if I came from my home college, Holy Family, and I had a master's in nursing and not a PhD. And did I tell you how much money I make? And did I tell you what kind of car? Did I tell you where I live? Society says those are the things that allow us to command respect. That's the Hobbesian Enlightenment notion. And there's a lot in the handout that teases what's the grounding. Almost all of our mission statements, our ethical codes, say we respect people independent of their gender, race, religion, blah, 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 nature of illness, age, and yet that's not true in most people's experience. So it's reasonable for people to think that they won't be respected at the end of life if they don't measure up to. I mean, this isn't a pleasant woman. Look at her. What is your name? Kathy. Why would you respect Kathy when she's been so crotchety? She's been my roommate. She's been your roommate. Okay, we've got proof here. Okay, why would we respect this woman? And so you've got, now, why does this matter? It matters because, and in particular, in the context of long-term care, if I get a message from you that you don't respect me, God forgive, you give me horrible evaluations, and you say to Chris, why did you recommend her? She was a bust. It was a waste of a plenary session this morning. And I get that feedback from Charity and John and folks. I'm going to say, what do those people at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity know? They like me in other arenas. They like me at the Mayo Center. This group doesn't know a good thing when they get it. Okay, because my sense of self doesn't turn on one experience. But now strip me of everything that gives meaning and purpose to my life. Put me in a nursing home, flat on my back, set me up in a jerry chair, and yours is the face that I see every day. You become my world of meaning. Put me in an ICU bed. You are my world of meaning. And in every interaction, we communicate one of three messages. It's a violent drop dead. Get out of my face. It's you're nothing to me. You're an object to your job to be done. Or you're a person of worth and I care about you. We do it in our families. Are you married? Oh, yeah. Who cooks? Oh, she does. Okay, you probably know at the end of the day if you're a job to be done or a husband to be loved as she puts your dinner in front of you. You know, and I'm sure there are days when she's driving home and she's saying, I hope I have food. I don't care if he likes it. I just want to get something on the table. You know if you're a kid to be gotten into bed at night, if you're a job to be done or a kid to be loved. Like, that's part of our daily experience. But now put yourself in a dependent position where you don't have a lot of control over who those people are around you. What is the message that you get on a daily basis? One of our sisters, who died at 41 of ovarian cancer after 2 of the hardest years of dying that I've seen, who had intestinal obstructions, who was in and out of the hospital, had surgeries. She spent days retching. She said to me close to her dying, "Carol, please tell your students, when I first got sick, it didn't matter how people treated me because I knew who I was." She was the president of our college. She had a PhD in biology. She was one of our community leaders. She was from Worcester, Massachusetts, had that delightful New England reserve. She was a gentle, loving, wise, marvelous human being. She said, "As I've grown weaker, I become whomever people make me." And she said, "If a nurse comes in here and moves me like meat, I become meat." And I wanted to cry that I, or a member of my profession, had the capacity to take a Lillian and transform her to a slab of meat by virtue of what I said or didn't say. This is a central ethical question. What is the effect of our cumulative relationships with people in long-term care? And going back to my Philadelphia experiences, a lot of the aides who were on the front lines every day of providing care for residents did not come from families where they experienced respectful looks, respectful speech, respectful touch. And you can't automatically expect them to come into a professional caregiving experience and know how to do that. And there's a huge challenge for leadership to model the behaviors. We've done that in our School of Nursing. We espoused a model of care. I said, you can't expect them to go out and be professional carers if that's not what they experience from the faculty when they're with us. So who are the role models? Somebody said to me recently at a conference, she works with aides in long-term care, and she said, I actually have them make bread in teams. And she said, 1, I want them to get the team concept, and 2, we talk about being 11. And I said, when you think about that, being 11, you've got to get worked into the dough. And there's bruising involved in that. And it's not easy. But that's what we're about. Now, how do we teach and hold staff accountable to develop the type of relationships that say to people, you're a person of worth and I care about you? There's a lot of material in there about dignity that I'm not going to have time to do. Another fear is the fear of an endless succession of meaningless days. And that's that spirituality of aging that I spoke to earlier. I think I would like to get up in the morning someday and have nothing, just nothing on my schedule. But I think if I did it for a short while, it would get old fast. So picture waking up every morning and there's nothing on your schedule except maybe to show up for meals. What is it that gives meaning and purpose? And that's where that stuff that I started out with is so important, about the type of journeying. How do we deal with that integrity versus despair? The fear of dying alone. Now think about that. That wouldn't be the situation in long-term care, but for many of the elderly, even in long-term care, fear of dying alone where there's people around, but it's Julie says, my life matters to no one. Somebody in a nursing home situation said to me, I put my best nurses with the dying residents, as opposed to these are the ones we don't have to worry about because there's nothing more we can do for them. Think of that. It says this matters, and economic fears. I'm going to conclude at this point because I'm almost out of time. I think the challenge, I guess the message that I want to leave you with, if we think about long-term care, and whether it's people with chronic illness or our elders, There is an incredible vulnerability in this group, which I think many Americans have simply left to somebody else to figure out how that gets handled. And yet it's a harsh critique on us as a moral society if we're not looking at what our obligations are. And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. Take it a step further, look at some of the group homes. I know there's conferences looking at aging. We just had a huge expose in the Washington Post about mentally impaired adults and the type of groups homes that they're living in. There's a lot of gross violations of human dignity in the living environments of many of these folks. So what are the gifts that we have? How can we use them to help those who are in need? Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and there may be time for one or two questions. Okay.
I have a question. We've been here this weekend and we've talked a lot about caregiving, but could you address the whole commandment of love thy neighbor as thyself and servanthood? Because we really haven't talked about that, and we're in the forefront, and if we don't, I know it's a big issue with boundaries and you want to be professional, but as Christians, if we don't love them, it's a burden to do our job. So,
if we don't love them, it's a burden. If we don't love people entrusted to our care.
yes.
Okay, I thought you were actually going to ask the other piece. Because if we talk about the need to care for others, the piece that we often don't pay attention to is love others as you love yourself. And that is a huge challenge. I'm working with a long-term care community in DC right now where the staff, and somebody talked about it in the context of performance punishing, where everybody who's good we assign more work to. And there comes a point where you can't keep giving what you don't have. And this is a long-term care community and hospice which has as one of their guiding principles creating a balance or paying attention to the balance between professional and personal lives. So I want to make that point in the but if you're talking about the other, if you look at American bioethics, it is secular. And we don't talk about love as a virtue. That makes it all work. I mean, love is what makes it work. Now, but there needs to be a profound understanding of what we mean by love. And there's tough love, but there's compassionate love. And that's what I say, why do we do what we do? To me, love goes to motivation. And I don't think we can pretend to be any type of caregiver if we don't have as a motivation. As a professional caregiver with no religious beliefs, I can't put myself present to somebody saying, how can I help you, if underlying that statement isn't a commitment to subjugate my interests to promoting the interest of the other, and that's love. Now, for Christians who are doing this, our ministry is to continue the healing ministry of Jesus. And Jesus didn't do it to make money. He didn't do it to be a wake-up call. He did it because he loved people. That was the grounding. And somewhere we've got to untap that motivation. I couldn't agree with you more, if that's the point of what you're asking.
And with that, I don't know if you could address it on a second part. I'm a hospice nurse, and even in the hospital on the medical floor, to me it's not really all that different because you're
Right.
dealing with an aging population. But as Christians, and especially Christian settings, if you've got a Christian healthcare, people have got to be allowed to grieve and know that it is okay that they are upset or that they have lost that, and that we see the value in encouraging one another. Because the regulations for hospice say that the social worker and the chaplain are supposed to be available, and in most settings, there is no support for the nurses for that grieving. And the church does not, and I'm not trying to put physicians down or anything, but we are with those dying patients, and we are doing the physical care, and we become the most intimate person more so than the family, sort of like what you're talking about your mom, to those people. And when they die, sometimes it is worse than when you have had a family member die because of proximity. And the church does not support or cover us with prayer that we need. And we cannot do it alone without you. And the physicians have also got to encourage the nurses on what we're doing, because we're willing to do that and stand in the gap for you, because most of you do care. Sometimes I think maybe it's because predominantly you're men, or at least that I'm dealing with, and you've got to draw back a little bit from the dying thing. And that's okay, but we do need your prayer, and we do need that it's okay for us to grieve.
I think you said it more eloquently than I could. Thank you.
One quick question. I got stimulated in thinking in what you were talking about. A long-term healthcare facility is a prison. And I wonder if you could say something about, this has nothing to do with capital punishment. It has to do with the fact that people die in prison. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that.
Specifically, you're talking about incarcerated.
Incarcerated people, yeah.
I don't have personal experience there. I've been beginning to read literature that says this is a horribly neglected population, people who are aging in prisons. And if you think about, and any of us who are starting to get older and experiencing some limitations and would like to make our lives comfortable, there are very little means to do that. So you take somebody that society says is deserving of punishment for a crime, there's almost that they deserve whatever they get, and it ought to be as bad as we can make it. And there is a lot of that thinking present in this culture. So I don't think in the time that we have here I can do justice to this question other than to say we can't all know what's happening in all vulnerable populations. But when I ended and said, what are the gifts God has given you? If it's sensitivity for this group, one of the places where I was working, it was a community where nurses in a hospital were seeing aging prison inmates frequently admitted with major complications that, had they been addressed up front, would not have developed into the problems that they were. Well, if you experience something like that, you can say, I can do my job today and fix the problems that they came for. Or if I begin to see this revealing that there are problems in the prison, then maybe I have a responsibility to raise questions appropriately there. And that's a matter of each of us looking at what are the experiences that we've had, what human needs are there, and what are the resources that we have because of our positions to address them. Somebody needs to be issuing that challenge to us. And I'm sorry I can't say more to that. Thank you.